All right, welcome everybody to the Friends of the Cabildo lecture series. I hope that you're having a good election day and have a little bit of time to take a little break from what's going on out there. So I hope you have joined us to have a great time tonight and to learn a little bit about, or actually a pretty good amount about Spanish Louisiana. Just a quick reminder that we have two lectures in this month. We have one next Tuesday with Bruce Spicer, a local um, writer here in New Orleans who is an expert on the Beatles, and this is the 40th and I mean the 60th anniversary of the Beatles concert um, at City Park in 1964, and we're actually going to have a concert with that. Unfortunately, it's sold out, so if you don't have tickets, I'm sorry you can't make it, but we have we've done really well with it. So I hope you take advantage of Bruce's lecture because he's be talking about the City Park show and really detailing that. But tonight we're going to be hosting Frances Turnbell. She teaches at the University of North Alabama, and she is done an unbelievable book through LSU Press that is about Spanish Louisiana. And Francis, I saw that it said that this is the first compilation of Spanish Louisiana. That feels like that is somewhat a big task that was put on your plate there.
Just a little bit, just a little bit. Yeah, the
So with that,
project
I want to
surprised
welcome.
me too.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I want to welcome Frances Turnbull and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Jason. I'm really happy to be here. I want to thank obviously the Friends of the Cabildo for having me, and I'd also like to thank everybody at LSU Press for really a beautiful finished product in my book. So, as Jason said, I'm here to discuss my book, Spanish Louisiana: Contest for Borderland, 1763 to 1803. And the the best way to start just thinking about this book and its project is, I guess, at the beginning of how I came to it. And really, I didn't intend to even, you know, think much about Spanish Louisiana, to be quite honest. This entire thing started with a much smaller research project about the Acadian diaspora. I was early on interested in the Acadian migration, specifically to Louisiana, where they become the forefathers of the Cajuns. There's a great deal that's been written about the diaspora, and Carl Brasso has his seminal work on um, the Cajuns, Acadian to Cajun. But through this sort of early interest, I became introduced to the colonial era in the 1760s, essentially, because the Acadians come to Louisiana uh, during the 1760s, and then there's another wave of them in 1785. And so, as part of my research, I encountered Dan Usner's book, Indian Settlers and Slaves in a Frontier Exchange Economy, which is really the cornerstone for any research of the colonial Mississippi Valley. And this book just changed my life, literally. It changed my understanding of history and of the colonial world. I was captivated by the incredible interpersonal and intergroup dynamics and networks at work in the 18th century in the lower Mississippi Valley. Just dynamism I hadn't seen represented in um, historical writings before, and a window into a time in a place that I thought I knew somewhat well. And what I learned really was from this book in particular that has followed me into my studies of Spanish Louisiana and other work, it is just to appreciate how much this was not a static place. I think we often tend to think about history as something static, and people as travel was so much more difficult back then. We sometimes think mistakenly that people just didn't go very far, and that's always not always the case, and that's certainly not the case in what we see in the 18th century lower Mississippi Valley, including Spanish Louisiana. From this earlier project, um, sort of sprang my interest in the colonial era and the way that all the people on the ground, the various colonists who had come at different points of the 18th century, the various native peoples and enslaved people, how they interacted and how they sort of carved out a world for themselves there. So as I pursued this early research, um, uh, as I said, I was just sort of captivated by this dynamic um, world of the post 7 Years War, lower Mississippi Valley, Louisiana, and what we would call soon here British West Florida. Um, and we see here on this, fairly simplistic map, but we get a sense of just the shift in property territory claims that transpires at the end of the 7 Years War, and sort of introduces sort of even more movement and drama to the Mississippi Valley. Um, and the Acadians were completely part of what was going on here. Uh, we have, let me go back to that map. We had shifting empires, as you can see, incredible uncertainty as France gives up its claims to North America, competing and shifting alliances with and among Native peoples. It's also important to remember that in the 1760s, this area is predominantly inhabited by various Native groups, not by colonists and enslaved people. They're really living in just sort of small pockets in various, you know, plantation areas along the Mississippi or at New Orleans or port cities, Biloxi, Mobile. Additionally, we have a very creative and adaptive and diverse colonial population. There were so many different groups moving around in this place. A crazy number of languages being spoken and ethnicities, and all of these different groups of people with their various languages and backgrounds were communicating. They were trying to carve out life for themselves. They were bickering with each other, but they were really all seeking some semblance of stability in what by the end of the French period is a pretty neglected borderland space. And so really, at this point, it's their local networks and their local alliances that are holding their society together more than attachment to an empire, although they will come to think fondly of their memories of the French Empire. So the Spanish Empire, though, the Spanish period, as I became aware of it in my sort of early interest again in those Acadians and their migration, most of their migration takes place during the Spanish period. And even those Acadians who arrive as the French are still there, the French are getting ready to hand over the territory to the Spanish. So they're thinking about the Spanish. So what was Spanish Louisiana? Now, how could we think about it? How should we think about it? We traditionally think about Louisiana first as something French, right? We think about that French heritage, the French colony, and we jump very quickly from the close of the 7 Years War in 1763, 40 years later, to the Louisiana Purchase, where the United States secures the vast territory that takes us from sea to shining sea. But what I began to ask was what happened in between. And so we go from a nebulous and uncertain world in 1763 to 1803, where the capital, New Orleans, is stamped with Spanish architecture. The territory itself is stamped with Spanish land grants. The population of Louisiana has grown dramatically. And Louisiana is on the cusp of sugar and cotton really taking off. And New Orleans as a port city is sort of a rising star. Additionally, in that 40-year period, we see in world history and history that's important for our story tonight, the dawn of the American Revolution, the age of revolutions, really. First with the American Revolution, then the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution. And so we realize, that 1763 and 1803 are really two different worlds. They're worlds apart. And so as I went about my research, I came to realize that the Spanish period, which we really don't talk about nearly enough, was an incredible 4 decades of becoming, a very dynamic 4 decades of becoming. And of so much movement of people and of trade, and so much uncertainty and various moments with a sense of possibility. What would the future hold for this place? So to give you, I keep referencing the movement that just sort of captured my imagination and still fascinates me. To give you some idea of what's going on at the end of the 7 Years' War, um, what we see is, the French preparing to exit from their territory in 1763. They, you know, past the land east of the Mississippi, except for the Isle of Orleans, on to the British. The British are happy to be taking on this territory, and they begin pouring into this area we're going to call British West Florida very quickly. And we're obviously there's a military presence, but we also want to think about colonists and traders and merchants, and they're going to play those traders and merchants are going to play a very important role in the region's history and in the history of Spanish Louisiana and even the American Revolution. So besides, these people pouring in to British West Florida, we also see an outmigration from that area into Louisiana of many small native groups. Together, we call them the Petite Nation. And these smaller groups had been long allied with France and had suffered from slaving at the hands of the Chickasaws and their British allies. And so initially, the Petite Nation didn't want to have anything to do with being part of the British Empire. And so they follow the French into what the territory that is supposed to become Spanish Louisiana. So we have native movement as well. We have Acadians arriving also as part of this post 7 Years' War drama. So we see that migration. Once the Spanish arrive, we continue to see various groups of settlers arrive in Louisiana, including Canary Islanders that the Spanish recruit in preparation for the American Revolution, trying to build up a population of loyal inhabitants who could also serve as militia. Excuse me. This is a move Spain makes actually in several colonies in its empire, rely on those Canary Islanders for this type of a population. We see them do something similar in San Antonio de Bejar in Texas, for example. And so in addition to these different groups, we also see the Spanish period. We see an incredible influx of enslaved people. The official slave trade to Louisiana existed in those final decades of French rule, primarily as a trickle of contraband trade. So it did persist, but it really was on a fairly small scale. But once Spain acquires Louisiana and takes possession of Louisiana, which we'll talk about in a minute, but that doesn't happen for Spain in 1763. The first governor doesn't arrive until 1766. But once Louisiana is firmly in Spanish hands, we see that slave trade really open up again with just sort of an ongoing influx of enslaved people to Louisiana, which is, of course, going to have long-term consequences for not only the society, but also if we think about the culture of Louisiana and the history of that culture as well. And then throughout the Spanish period, we will continue to see Native people seeking the possibility of moving into Spanish territory as they, after the American Revolution, especially sort of are trying to escape the disruption caused as American settlers pour into the Trans-Appalachian West. So many people, they scratch their heads and say, wait a minute, Spain was in Louisiana. And, as Jason said, it is kind of surprising that it took this long for, really an attempt. That's what it is a first attempt of someone at a history of Spanish Louisiana. There is a lot of scholarship out there. There's a tremendous amount of really fine scholarship, great archival work, and deep studies of very particular things. The Canary Islanders, for example, or slavery in colonial Louisiana, or even the British merchants, for example, aspects of the American Revolution. But in spite of this incredible research, the more I looked at what was out there, I really was convinced that a lot of it wasn't speaking to each other. The literature wasn't, referencing each other. There were a lot of sort of standalone projects or, projects by a single author that maybe, continued to draw on that particular author's work. And so one of my major goals is really to bring that rich literature into conversation with one another, and also to begin to tie it into broader literatures as well about the American Revolution, for example, the early Republic, and also the Atlantic world as well. And so all of that is part of the framing of my project and the conceptualization of it as well. And while I think we don't talk about Spain or this period enough, I am edified that since I began this project, 15, 20 years ago, approximately, recent publications and museum exhibits are really beginning to draw attention to Spanish Louisiana, and I find that very edifying. And I'm excited to be part of this wave of scholarship and interest. And so here, let me show you. We have just an image of British West Florida, which is the territory I was just talking about that the British acquire at the end of the 7 Years' War, where again the Brits are happy to come here. The merchants and sort of even smaller traders recognize the Gulf Coast and Mississippi Valley rightly as just a new market for them to tap into. And additionally, I just want to reference again the just adaptation and flexibility of the inhabitants of Spanish Louisiana, the diverse inhabitants. They had to find ways to communicate. They had, to work with various translators and all sorts of things. We see a lot of improvisational and adaptational trade and practices and alliances and things like that. So anyway, one of the major goals of the book is to say, yes, Spain was here. The Spanish Empire did, in fact, include Louisiana for roughly 40 years. The Spanish era happened, and in fact, it mattered. It mattered for Louisiana history, certainly. It still does. But it also mattered for U.S. history, for American history. Another ongoing issue, I think, for the study of Spanish Louisiana and other places, and their appreciation in the broader literature, is that French and Spanish colonial spaces and imperial stories are often pushed to, pushed to the margins. They're overshadowed. This is also true often of Native history as well. These different types of histories are too often not recognized in our traditional national narratives. And I'm not knocking national narratives. I actually think they can be important. However, I am arguing for a more complete narrative, a fuller story, and I think that that's something that I do offer here. This book shows some key ways that the Spanish era and Louisiana's diverse inhabitants, empires, native peoples, borderland folks, enslaved peoples, all on the ground, ways that they're relevant and in fact important, an important part of our national story, particularly in its discussion of Spain's and Louisiana's involvement in the American Revolution and in the competition that follows the revolution for the Trans-Appalachian West. Another objective of the book is to highlight that dynamism that first brought me to the project and the agency of the many groups and individuals living and operating in 18th century Spanish Louisiana. In fact, I argue that the Spanish period is best understood as a contest of sorts amidst between the empire on one hand and its allies, and borderland inhabitants sort of seeking stability, seeking the best thing for their own futures. Amidst the tumult and uncertainty of the late 18th century, Louisiana's inhabitants, operating in an uncertain borderland, sought to preserve Louisiana as a flexible zone where they found security in local adaptive networks and alliances rather than an empire. They like to have a lot of options open to them so that they could choose at various moments what they thought would be the most stable path. Now, sometimes that included cooperating with empires, but for the most part, the peoples inhabiting, excuse me, Lower Louisiana did not view empire as the only path to a secure future. Spain, on the other hand, attempted to control and contain the inhabitants, especially through policy and efforts meant to bolster loyalty and alliance for Spain. Um, these policies were often related to migration, trade, and movement. And this isn't by accident. It's not just because I happen to be interested in those things. Um, the dawn of the Spanish period, which again I keep saying, but it can't be stated enough, at the end of the 7 Years' War, it's going to coincide with a new era of empire, and this is important, for what we think of as the traditional um, British North American colonies, those 13 colonies, as well. And some of this may sound familiar if we think about that context as well. But Great Britain and Spain embarked after the 7 Years' War on a path of reorganizing their empires. Both were interested in gaining greater control, not only of their colonies, but also of the populations inhabiting those colonies, increasing efficiencies, extracting greater wealth. And part of this was an effort to control and manage the movement of their subjects. Um, in this context, Spain formulated its policies for Louisiana. So we're going to see this tension play out in the book, this tension between Spain seeking constantly throughout the Spanish period to amass as many allies as it can, as many loyal groups within the colony, wooing various groups throughout the period. And at different moments, different groups do work with Spain, and at others they don't. And we'll discuss some of that in just a moment. So Spain's going to agree to take on Louisiana at the end of the 7 Years' War as part of a particular vision. And this is a vision sort of for its larger empire. Humiliated at the end of the 7 Years' War by Britain, which captured the two great fortified cities of Havana and Manila in the war, Spain sort of coming off of this sort of terrible moment in imperial history, not only is regrouping and trying to rework its empire and return to glory, but it is also waiting for revenge. And Louisiana is thought perhaps to have a part to play in this future plan for revenge. What does Spain want in Louisiana exactly? It's not going to be a Cuba. It's not going to be a new Spain in the sense of the wealth and value that these places bring to the empire. But Louisiana is meant to play a particular role, and that role is as a defensive borderland initially, and as we get closer to the American Revolution, a defensive borderland from which Spain might launch attack against British territory. And throughout the Spanish period, really a space that Spain can use to engage in espionage, first against Britain and then against the United States as well. So Louisiana is going to sort of hold this role of defensive borderland, first against Britain until the end of the American Revolution, and then against the United States. And at various moments, Spain hopes, occasionally maybe it will even make a profit off of this colony. Even though Spain's somewhat skeptical about the reality of that hope. And so just to take you into the specifics a little bit more of the story that I tell, the first chapter of Spanish Rule and the first chapter of my book begin with the first governor, the coming of the first Spanish governor to Louisiana, Antonio de Ulloa. Now, as I mentioned, the Brits arrived in 1763 and continue to arrive in British West Florida. The fact that Spain does not manage to get its first governor to Louisiana until 1766 causes a great deal of sort of anxiety and concern about Louisiana's future and Spain's actual interest in ruling this colony. Now, among the reasons that Antonio de Ulloa was sort of, we might think, late in arriving to Louisiana, is that Spain was actually trying to be very intentional as it incorporated Louisiana into its empire. It was trying to imitate various French policies, especially France's Indian policies, which were recognized by Spain and Britain as sort of the best Indian policies of an empire in North America. And so Spain had been attempting to acquire just the right trade goods in preparation for Antonio de Ulloa's arrival in Louisiana. And so that was the sort of the final thing that delayed his departure from Cuba. So he sets foot in New Orleans in March 1766. But for a variety of reasons, he does not last long. And in 1768, we see the events of the New Orleans revolt break out. Now, this revolt is at least in part a response to Ulloa's efforts to promulgate and then enforce some of Spain's new policies that are part of this era of reform, specifically those related to managing and monitoring trade and commerce. And so that really is sort of the greatest issue. There are other catalysts as well for the revolt. We, in fact, see in October 1768 the turnout of almost the entire free population of New Orleans and the areas around the city as Ulloa is ousted and sent packing back to Cuba. Meanwhile, as this is going on, native peoples throughout the region are again wondering, is Spain here? Is Spain not? What's going on? And finally, the following year, in 1769, General Alejandro O'Reilly arrives in New Orleans in August with a military presence larger than the free population of New Orleans, and he firmly incorporates Louisiana into the Spanish Empire and demands oaths of loyalty from New Orleans and throughout the lower colony as well. As he is coming in, we also want to recognize that he's really an important person. He's one of the sort of key strategists to reshaping Cuba's defenses and militia following the 7 Years' War. So it's significant that Spain sends him to sort of reclaim Louisiana after this act of rebellion in 1768. So O'Reilly is going to sort of pass the baton fairly quickly to another governor, Luis de Unzaga. And as these political things are happening, the inhabitants of the lower colony are continuing in sort of their daily life, their trade practices, their alliances, but they're also becoming connected to these British trade networks that are sort of overtaking the region. And these are making the Spanish officials, whether they're Francophones who've transferred their allegiance to Spain or that they've come from Cuba with O'Reilly, they're making these officials a little bit nervous. The inhabitants of the colony, had just ousted the first governor, and now they're cooperating with the enemy British along the river, gaining their trade goods, selling their surplus. Now, at what moment are these colonists going to be loyal to Spain versus to Britain? Excuse me. And how much is Spain going to be able to rely on them? And this is a question, a real question that Spain is asking itself on the eve of war. As we move into the 1770s, Louisiana is going to be involved in the American Revolution, and indeed, Spanish involvement, Louisiana's involvement and Spanish involvement at large, these are generally underappreciated. In a Louisiana history, we see an amazing cooperation of the inhabitants, including Indian allies, and empire in its projects against British West Florida. We're going to talk about these a little bit more in just one second. And then finally, after considering the American Revolution, the book then pivots to the aftermath of the war. And so I really see that as sort of the American Revolution is sort of the center of the story. Again, not because I set off to write a national narrative, but it really is the turning point from Spain acquiring the colony, thinking for revenge, seeking for revenge, using the colony for revenge, achieving that revenge to some degree. And then the so what? What now? How do we manage this colony in North America with an expanding but uncertain United States? And so the tensions of alliance and policy and practice play out in the war's aftermath. And in Louisiana's experience of the Age of Revolutions, again, it participates in the American Revolution, but the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution also have consequences for Louisiana. And so among the things that do develop in this aftermath, we see a changing plantation economy. We see efforts on the part of Spain to tighten controls around maroon communities, those communities of runaway slaves, the struggles of the Petite Nation, those smaller Indian groups who had proven their own loyalty again to Spain during the American Revolution. And we really see, the 1780s and 1790s as an era of just incredible uncertainty in the Trans-Appalachian West. And that uncertainty affects the instability and this sort of sense of that instability in those final 2 decades of Spanish rule. And so what I would like to do in the last couple of minutes, I'd like to read to you, if you'll bear with me, from the beginning of my chapter 3, just so you can get a sense of how I tackle these sort of broader themes in a specific way and root them in the story of Spanish Louisiana. As they left Point Coupee, Baptiste and his fellow voyagers considered what they had just learned of the disruption on the Mississippi. Their curiosity may have already been piqued before leaving Natchitoches for New Orleans on April 9th, 1778. The travelers on André Esclavon's barge included the free black Baptiste, Quapaw Indian, and several others. They had likely heard about the American raids that rocked West Florida and Louisiana in the preceding months, so in early 1778. At Point Coupee, they had discovered for themselves the distressed refugees from neighboring British West Florida, taking asylum in Spanish Louisiana. Men and women who had lost their homes and livestock, who had chosen to cross the international boundary to escape danger. As a free person of color, perhaps Baptiste was moved in a different way than the others upon learning that the American raiders had targeted many enslaved West Floridians as booty. On April 16, 1778, after a brief pause at Point Coupee, Baptiste and the others returned to their original project, voyaging to New Orleans with 100 carats of tobacco. In recent years, Spain had begun to encourage Louisiana's domestic production of tobacco, one of several initiatives directed at developing the local economy and building bonds between Louisiana's inhabitants and the empire. At New Orleans, the little group found the drama of the American raids on the lower Mississippi continuing to unfold. Indeed, they were far from the only travelers in the city. Britons of every political persuasion had made their way to New Orleans. All vied for the ear of Governor Bernardo de Galvez. And so I'll talk a little bit about what's happening here in a specific way. What we've just heard described, this event is called Willing's Raid in early 1778. We see James Willing leave what's now the area of Pittsburgh, take the Ohio, travel the Ohio River Valley, then the Mississippi, and descend upon West Florida in a raid authorized by the Second Continental Congress. And he was a man familiar with the area. He had settled, maybe settled's the wrong word, but he had tracts of land in British West Florida. He had lived in British West Florida on those tracts of land and operated business alongside Oliver Pollock, who's an important, who is the most important connection between the Spanish government and the early United States in New Orleans. And so he's got knowledge of the land, knowledge of the place. He also has some grudges as well. So he and this party of patriot raiders are going to attack this coast of British West Florida along the Mississippi River, you know, burning things, stealing booty. They produce a tremendous panic as patriot and loyalist and friend and enemy of James Willing alike, essentially abandon British West Florida for Spanish territory, and travel to these little outposts that you see on this map, Point Coupee, Galvez Town, Fort St. Gabriel de Manchac. All of these places are overrun with British colonists fleeing this raid. And so what happens is that this moment brings in a very tangible way the American Revolution to the lower Mississippi Valley. And this is problematic because Spain is neutral. Spain is actually neutral in the American Revolution until 1779. And so the governor Bernardo de Galvez is not ready to participate in the war at this point. And so this is the conflict that Baptiste and his fellow travelers encounter as they're on their way to New Orleans to sell their tobacco. And as I mentioned, and this is an example of it, we see in the years leading up to Spain's involvement in the American Revolution, an effort on Spain's part to woo those Spanish colonists to have greater attachment to the Spanish Empire. And from the days of Ulloa on, colonists had complained that there was no outlet for their produce within the Iberian world, within the Spanish Empire. And so Spain was trying to encourage the cultivation of tobacco, hoping that this would be something that could work both for Louisiana and for the empire. And we see that happening on large and small scale in this particular story. Jose de Galvez is, of course, sort of this important mastermind on the part of Spain, the minister of the Indies, who's really taking particular attention in Louisiana, having his nephew Bernardo de Galvez appointed governor, and thinking about place-specific policy, really in a careful way on the eve of war. Among other things that we'll also see in this unfolding of Willing's raid is these Petite Nation Indians that had initially moved into Spanish Louisiana. They, like the colonists living in Louisiana, had sort of wavered. They were happy to do business like the colonists with the British in West Florida. Unlike colonists, they settled in British West Florida and then back again in Spanish Louisiana and back again in British West Florida. So they used their own mobility to their own advantage during this period. But after Willing's raid, the Petite Nation remain in Spanish Louisiana. At this point, these two empires have been tested. What can Britain do for the British colonists in this event of Willing's raid? Really nothing, actually. And the colonists, the inhabitants of the lower Mississippi Valley, they know it. And so this experience boosts the resolve and boosts the sentiments of Native peoples and inhabitants of Louisiana, their faith in the Spanish Empire, and in this sense that if war breaks out, that they are in fact going to be loyal to the Spanish Empire. And so really that's a sort of brief look at my approach, but loyalties and alliances again are really the key to this contested space of Louisiana. Loyalties and alliances again, we're not static. We're seeing that here, and Spain recognized that in its constant efforts to encourage loyalties and alliances. Would a group that opposed Spain in 1768 fight for Spain in the American Revolution? By and large, they actually did. Would free blacks who fought for Spain in the American Revolution remain loyal in the age of revolutions that follows? Would loyalists who opposed Spain in the American Revolution, would they aid Spain in the revolutionary age that followed? These were all real questions that sort of shaped the story of the time and of the place. And so I'd like to thank you so much for traveling with me to 18th century Louisiana this evening, and for allowing me to discuss my book a little bit with you.
Oh man, Francis, you've got you had a lot of work on your hands over that time period. Really, really impressive work. So if anybody that's that's on here that does have a question, please use the chat function. I'd be happy to ask them. You mentioned early on about the movement of Native Americans
Yeah.
into Louisiana. I've actually never heard that before. Was that common at all? Was that just specifically a Spanish thing, or was that sort of common with French areas and British one areas as well?
Yeah, and I think, this sort of speaks to my one of my points throughout was I think we think a lot about the movement of people being more static, but also I think Native history really falls into that as well. I think um, we don't realize today how much um, development and evolution each group's story had, and I think that a lot of um, you know what we see during, sorry, I'm trying to get to my, excuse me, get to my way I want to frame this. A lot of borderlands like Spanish Louisiana, for example, um, or New France, near where it bordered with British claimed territory in the Northeast. These borderlands, especially where there's going to be warfare between the empires, these were definitely spaces where you saw um, some fluidity of movement of Native peoples, especially smaller groups that used movement as a strategy for survival. Um, and because of wars, different groups are preyed upon, and so their numbers suffer. And so, anyway, in both of those kinds of spaces, you see that definitely happen in New France as well. But just as a mechanism for self-preservation, to move to other places. And there are a bunch of there are many different of these little groups, and I do go into pretty good detail about as much as I was able to find about them and their specific relocation efforts. So that was something really interesting. I didn't set out to uncover, but that I found in the sources and was a really fascinating aspect of the world of Spanish Louisiana.
Yeah, really, really interesting research you found there. And I guess it would also mean that they were not just trying to preserve themselves from the colonists, they were also trying to get from the other Native Americans that might be
Oh,
attacking.
right,
You mentioned that as
right.
well. There were some that
Right,
were,
yeah. So the Chickasaws were the most powerful group, and we say the greater Southeast. I mean, they're kind of not just Southeast; they're also north of the Southeast.
right.
But I mean, they were more important than Britain if we think about it as a military force for most of the 18th century. And so, you know, groups like these that had been preyed upon by the British and the Chickasaws, who had a really important alliance for most of the 18th century. Um, they were very sensitive, um, to that part of the story, to that balance of power. Um, and the French exit basically throws off the counterbalance to the British Chickasaw alliance, and that also is why they exit.
My next question was about you mentioned Galvez and how important the Spaniards were towards assisting in the American Revolution. How aware was native Spain aware of the involvement of Galvez? You mentioned that his uncle is the uh, got
He's the
him
minister of
appointed.
the Indies. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, or is he just communicating with Cuba, or are they, it's not like something you could just pick up a phone and say, "Hey guys, do we want to be involved?"
right. No, he arrives anticipating
Okay.
that that there will be war, and there will probably be war, and that he needs to prepare Louisiana for such a conflict. That's um, readying the military is one of his objectives when he arrives. It's on the list of things he was given to do.
Yeah. You mentioned also some amazing sources and exhibits and stuff like that. Do you mind mentioning maybe one really great source that you used and maybe one great exhibit that you took part in? Not took part
Well,
in, but saw. Yeah.
um, I know there was. I actually didn't get to see this one, but I know there was a portraits exhibit um, of the portraits from the Spanish period, the Ogden, I think.
Okay.
And I thought that was really exciting to hear. Um, and oh, excuse me. There've been a number of publications and recent interest in kind of this era and place. I know LSU a year or two before my book has a book, Spanish New Orleans, which it looks pretty carefully at sort of what's going on in the merchant class of the city. Um, but as far as primary sources, I think that was where I found some of my most fun material. Was really in the correspondence between officials at little outposts like Point Coupee or the Attakapaw post or whatever, and the governor, because those those officials at these smaller outposts were keeping such careful records of who was going where when and who was trading what, and which native group had arrived, who was trying to relocate closer where after the American Revolution, when we see an uptick in the number of maroon communities, the number of slaves sort of seeking freedom by running away to these communities. You get a lot of the sort of nitty gritty on the ground information from this type of correspondence. And it was a really interesting vantage point.
And those primary sources, were they notarial archives? Is that where all that information is? Or, I mean, just the idea that you'd be
They're
talking about such an early
yeah,
time,
they
you still
most of them,
access those.
yeah. Probably my most important source base was it's called the Cuba Papers.
Okay.
Um, and it's out of the Spanish archives. There are microfilm collections of them in the States, but that's where I found the vast, the greatest amount of this type of correspondence and detailed level of record. It was really pretty amazing.
Wow. I bet it was pretty amazing to see all that information. I mean, just the idea that you could think you could find this correspondence from that time period and you could use that to your sources is really fascinating. And congratulations for you for
Thank
all the
you.
time and effort it probably took to put into that. So with that, I want to thank you so much, Francis. This is an absolutely fantastic topic. I will send everybody that is not on there who's watching election stuff and everything like that. I will send you a recording. I'll also send you a link that we sell the book in our store, as well as Francis provided us as well one from LSU Press. So I hope everybody has a great evening. I want to thank Francis so much for an amazing lecture and congratulations on the book.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jason. I really enjoyed getting to be here this evening.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And we'll see everybody next week talking about the 60th anniversary of the Beatles concert at City Park. Everyone have a great night. Thank you, Francis.
Bye-bye.